The helicopter blades chop through white silence, and below, through a gap in the spruce canopy, thermal imaging picks up a faint rectangular glow. Heat signature too consistent for wildlife, too isolated for a logging camp. The pilot marks the coordinates. It's February 1997, 9 years after the Holbrook family drove their green Ford Bronco into the Alaskan interior and never came back. What the state troopers will find inside that cabin, a single pair of child's snow boots placed carefully by the door, will finally explain the silence, but not ease it. Thomas Holbrook taught 8th grade science in Fairbanks. His wife, Claire, worked part-time at the public library and made sourdough starter that she'd been feeding for 6 years, a living thing she joked was their 4th child. Their daughters were Maya, 11, and Sophie, 7. The Holbrooks weren't adventurers by disposition. Thomas wore the same flannel shirts year-round. Claire kept meticulous grocery lists. But Alaska had a way of making the wilderness feel adjacent to ordinary life, not separate from it. They lived in a modest ranch house on the south side of town, the kind with a woodshed out back and a mudroom that smelled permanently of wet dog, though they didn't own one. Thomas had a CB radio set up in the garage, a hobby he'd picked up after reading about emergency communication networks. He'd talk to truckers on the Dalton Highway, to miners near Chicken, to anyone who'd respond on a Friday night while Claire graded spelling tests at the kitchen table. In late January 1988, Thomas mentioned to a colleague that he'd borrowed a friend's cabin for the long weekend. "Just past Nenana," he said. "Nothing fancy. Thought the girls could see the northern lights without the city glow." The colleague, a man named Don Peterson, later told investigators he'd been surprised. Thomas wasn't the cabin type, but Thomas had seemed excited, almost urgent about it. They left on Friday, February 5th after school. Claire had checked out 3 library books the day before, all due back in 2 weeks. Maya had a science project on glacial erosion due the following Thursday. Sophie had brought her favorite stuffed rabbit, a grey thing with one ear chewed off by their neighbor's cat years ago. The Bronco was packed with sleeping bags, a Coleman stove, canned soup, and a case of Coca-Cola. Thomas's one indulgence on these trips. The friend who owned the cabin, a man named Dale Fenwick, said later that Thomas had asked about the place in December, casual-like, just if it was available, if the heat worked, if the access road was passable in winter. Dale said sure, gave him a key, drew a rough map on a napkin at the Howling Dog Saloon. The cabin was 18 miles northeast of Nenana, off a logging road that dead-ended at a creek. No phone, no neighbors within 10 miles. Dale had used it for moose hunting, nothing more. Thomas left the napkin map on his desk at home. Investigators found it later, coffee-stained and folded. It showed the main highway, the turnoff at mile 73, then a series of squiggly lines representing the logging road. At the end, a small square labeled cabin, and a note, "Creek freezes solid deck march, firewood under tarp." They were expected back Sunday night. When they didn't show, and when Thomas missed Monday's classes, the school secretary called their house repeatedly. By Tuesday morning, Claire's mother drove from Anchorage to check on them. She found the mail piling up, the sourdough starter dry and cracked in its jar on the counter, and the heat turned down to 55 degrees, a setting meant for a short absence. The Alaska State Troopers opened a case Wednesday. Sergeant Howard Klein, 38, ex-Army, ran the initial investigation. He drove out to Nenana, found the logging road turnoff, followed the tire tracks in the frozen mud as far as they went. The road was passable, but rough. He saw evidence of a vehicle, compressed snow, a beer can, some cigarette butts that predated the Holbrooks by months, but no sign of the green Bronco. Klein called in aerial support. On Thursday, a Cessna 185 flew grid patterns over the area, the pilot scanning for vehicle wreckage, smoke, anything metallic. The forest was dense, the snow deep. They saw nothing. A ground team of 6 troopers and volunteers spent Friday and Saturday hiking the logging road, checking tributaries, calling out names. The temperature dropped to 15 below. The search was suspended Sunday for safety. Dale Fenwick led a second team to his cabin the following week. They found it locked, untouched, no tire tracks, no footprints. The firewood was still stacked under the tarp. Dale checked the interior, dusty, cold, exactly as he'd left it in November. "They never made it here," he told Sergeant Klein. Theories multiplied. Maybe Thomas had gotten turned around, taken a wrong spur road. Maybe the Bronco had gone through thin ice on a frozen lake. There were dozens within a 50-mile radius. Maybe they'd encountered mechanical failure, tried to hike out, succumbed to exposure. Maybe Thomas, under some private stress no one had detected, had driven his family somewhere else entirely, intentionally. Claire's mother insisted that was impossible. "She would have called," she said. "Claire called me every Sunday, every single one. But there were no payphones on the logging roads, no way to call if the Bronco had broken down or slid off an embankment. The Alaska wilderness swallowed people. It wasn't personal. It was statistical." The case went cold by March. Searches resumed briefly in May after the thaw, hoping to find the vehicle in a ravine or submerged in a lake. Divers checked 3 ponds. A dog team followed scent trails that went nowhere. By June, the Holbrooks were listed as missing, presumed deceased, though no bodies had been recovered. Claire's mother kept calling the troopers every month for the first year, then every few months. Then, just on the anniversary, the house stayed in her name, untouched, the sourdough starter thrown out but the jar washed and kept on a shelf. Maya's science project sat unfinished in a folder. Sophie's stuffed rabbit was on her bed. For 9 years, it stayed that way. In late 1996, the Alaska State Troopers received a grant to upgrade their search and rescue capabilities. One component was a partnership with a private aerial survey company that used forward-looking infrared, thermal imaging technology that had been used by the military since the 1970s but was only becoming practical for civilian search operations in the mid-1990s. The system detected heat signatures through forest canopy, useful for finding lost hikers, crash sites, even clandestine cabins used by fugitives. Sergeant Howard Klein, now 47 and greying at the temples, had kept a personal file on the Holbrook case. He'd transferred twice, remarried, quit smoking, but the file stayed in his desk drawer. When the FLIR program was announced, he submitted a list of cold cases for re-examination. The Holbrooks were third on his list. In February 1997, a helicopter crew conducted a systematic grid search of the area northeast of Nenana. The pilot was a man named Rick Tomlinson, former Coast Guard, who'd flown rescue missions in the Bering Sea. The FLIR operator was a technician named Carla Yates, trained by the manufacturer in Oregon. They flew low and slow, the system scanning the white landscape for anomalies. On the second day, 12 miles east of the logging road Dale Fenwick had described, the FLIR picked up a faint heat signature. The shape was rectangular, approximately 20 by 15 feet, consistent with a small structure. The surrounding area was dense forest, no roads visible, but the thermal bloom suggested something with insulated walls retaining residual warmth, possibly from sunlight, possibly from something else. Klein organized a ground team. They accessed the area from a different route, following a frozen creek bed on snowmobiles. The coordinates led them to a clearing they'd never searched before, one that wasn't on any of the maps Dale had drawn. In the clearing sat a cabin, older and smaller than Dale's, with a rusted metal roof and a stovepipe chimney. And parked beside it, half buried in snow and ice, was a green Ford Bronco. License plate, Alaska, 1987, registered to Thomas Holbrook. Klein approached the cabin slowly. The door was closed but not locked. Snow had drifted against the base. The windows were dark. He called out, heard nothing, then pushed the door open. The interior was frozen, but not empty. 3 bodies lay in sleeping bags on the floor, arranged close together near the wood stove. 2 adults, 2 children. The cold had preserved them, though ice crystals covered their skin and clothing. The stove was cold, no wood inside. On a small table sat an open notebook, a pencil beside it, and a flashlight with dead batteries. By the door, placed carefully on a square of newspaper, were a pair of child's snow boots, size small, bright red, with white laces. They were clean, dry, positioned as if someone had just stepped out of them. The scene was quiet in the way that horror is quiet when it's already over. Klein radioed for backup, for medical examiner, for documentation. The team photographed everything before touching anything. The bodies were eventually identified through clothing, wedding rings, and dental records. Thomas Holbrook, Claire Holbrook, Maya Holbrook, Sophie Holbrook, all deceased. No signs of trauma, no signs of violence. They had simply frozen, but the questions multiplied faster than the answers. This cabin wasn't Dale Fenwick's cabin. It belonged to a man named Ernest Haverford, deceased 1983, whose estate had never been settled. The property was landlocked, accessible only by creek or unmarked trails. Why had Thomas brought his family here instead of to Dale's place? Had he gotten lost? And if so, why had they stayed inside the cabin instead of walking out once they realized their mistake? The notebook on the table held the answers, written in Thomas's handwriting, the entries dated across 6 days. The Alaska Bureau of Investigation took custody of the evidence. The notebook was logged as item 14B, photographed page by page, transcribed. The entries were precise, methodical. Thomas had been a science teacher after all, trained to observe and document. February 5th evening. Made it to the cabin around 4:30 p.m. Took longer than expected. Missed the turn-off twice. Girls are excited. Claire's making soup. Stove works. Should be a good weekend. February 6th morning. Tried to head back, but the Bronco won't start. Battery dead or frozen. We'll wait for it to warm up. Plenty of food. Played cards with the girls. February 6th evening. Still no start. Temperature dropped hard. Checked the map. Realized this isn't Dale's cabin. Made a wrong turn somewhere. Creek outside is frozen. Hiked east for an hour this afternoon. Couldn't find the main road. Visibility poor. We'll try again tomorrow. February 7th. Hiked west this time, 3 hours round trip. No road, no landmarks I recognize. Girls are handling it well, but Claire's worried. I told her we'll walk out if we have to, follow the creek south, just need better weather. February 8th. Snowstorm all day, can't see 10 feet. Staying inside. Wood supplies low, only enough for 2 more days if we're careful. Claire's rationing the food. Maya asked if we were going to die. I told her no, that someone would find us or the storm would clear and we'd walk out. I don't know if I believe that. February 9th. Last of the firewood gone this morning. Broke up a chair and burned it. Tried the Bronco again. Completely dead. Discussed walking out. Claire says we should wait 1 more day, that the storm has to break. She's right, but I don't know if we have 1 more day. Temperature inside the cabin is below freezing now. Girls are in their sleeping bags. Sophie keeps asking about her shoes. We left them by the door to dry and now they're frozen to the floor. Small things become everything. February 10th. Can't feel my fingers well enough to write much. We're staying in the sleeping bags, all of us close. Claire is humming something, I don't know what. Girls are quiet. I keep thinking about the CB radio in the garage at home, how I could have brought a portable unit, how someone might have heard us. Funny what you regret. If someone finds this, we tried. We weren't careless, just unlucky. Tell Claire's mother we're sorry. The entry ended mid-sentence. The final word was sorry, underlined twice. The autopsies were performed in Fairbanks by Dr. Ellen Korsgaard, a forensic pathologist who'd worked in Alaska for 15 years. She confirmed hypothermia as the cause of death for all four. No drugs, no alcohol, no underlying medical conditions that would have prevented them from surviving the cold had they maintained heat. Time of death was estimated at February 10th or 11th, 1988, 9 years and 2 days before they were found. The timeline matched Thomas's notebook exactly, but forensic analysis raised further questions. Fiber samples from the sleeping bags showed they were standard camping gear, rated for 20 degrees Fahrenheit, cold but not deadly if combined with a heat source. The cabin's wood stove was functional, yet the wood supply had been minimal. Why? Investigators returned to the cabin in March after the snow melted. They documented everything: the interior layout, the condition of the structure, the contents of the Bronco. In the vehicle, they found the map Dale had drawn, still in the glove compartment. But they also found a second map, this one printed from a Fairbanks Outdoors shop, showing the general area but not the specific logging roads. Thomas had marked several routes in pencil, none of which led to Dale's cabin. A handwriting analyst compared the marks to samples of Thomas's writing. Confirmed match. He'd been trying to navigate, had marked multiple possible routes, and had chosen one that led him 12 miles off course. Accident, then. Bad luck. A wrong turn in deteriorating weather. It happened. Except it didn't fully explain the wood supply. Ernest Haverford's estate records, obtained through probate court, included an inventory from 1983. The cabin had been stocked with 2 cords of firewood stacked under tarp on north side. A cord of wood is 128 cubic feet, enough to heat a small cabin for weeks. Even accounting for decay and moisture, there should have been more than 2 days' worth when the Holbrooks arrived. Investigators searched the area around the cabin. They found the remnants of the tarp, rotted and torn, but no large woodpile. They found scattered pieces, weathered grey, embedded in the undergrowth. It appeared the wood had been there once, but had been removed or scattered over time. Wildlife? Possibly. Bears sometimes disturbed wood piles looking for rodents. But the dispersal pattern was odd, pieces 20, 30 feet from the cabin, half buried, as if deliberately moved. Sergeant Klein requested a second aerial survey, this time using standard photography rather than FLIR. The images, compared with older Forest Service maps from 1975, showed something unexpected. A trail, faint but visible, leading from Ernest Haverford's cabin northeast toward a larger structure 3 miles away. The structure was marked on the 1975 map as a ranger station, decommissioned in 1979. Klein and 2 investigators hiked the trail in April. They found the ranger station, collapsed and overgrown, but they also found evidence of habitation, recent within the last decade. Fire pits, trash, a hunting blind, and stacked against a tree, hidden under new-growth spruce, nearly 2 cords of firewood, weathered but unmistakably the same species and cut as the scraps around Haverford's cabin. Someone had taken the wood from the cabin before February 1988. Someone who'd been using the area illegally, who'd needed firewood for the decommissioned ranger station, who'd assumed the Haverford cabin was abandoned and fair game. The Alaska State Troopers cross-referenced their records for illegal activity in the area. They found 3 citations issued in 1986 and 1987 for hunting violations, out of season, wrong species, improper tags. All 3 citations were issued to the same individual, Carl Denton, age 42 in 1988, a former logger from Healy. Denton had a history. Assault in 1979, probation. Firearms violation in 1984, fine paid. Known to be transient, living off-grid, avoiding authorities. No fixed address, no phone, no vehicle registered in his name. But multiple witnesses placed him in the Nenana area through the mid-1980s, usually during fall and winter. Investigators located Denton in May 1997, living in a trailer outside Tok. He was 53, gaunt, missing teeth, cooperative in the way people are when they know resistance is futile. He admitted to using the old ranger station. He admitted to taking firewood from some old cabin in the area, said he'd figured it was abandoned, nobody around for years. When shown photos of the Haverford cabin, he confirmed it. Yeah, that's the one. Took maybe 3 loads over a couple months, late 87, early 88. Didn't think anyone would miss it. Did you see a green Bronco? Klein asked. A family? Late January, early February 1988? Denton shook his head. I was gone by then. Headed south for work. Didn't come back till spring. You took all the wood? Most of it. Left some, I think. Didn't need it all. The interrogation was recorded. Denton's statement was consistent, unrehearsed. He hadn't known the Holbrooks were there. Hadn't seen them, hadn't intended to harm anyone. He'd just taken firewood from an abandoned structure, something dozens of people did every winter in rural Alaska. But that act, thoughtless, minor, a petty theft of resources, had sealed the Holbrooks' fate. Without firewood, they couldn't maintain heat. Without heat, they couldn't survive long enough to walk out or wait for rescue. Carl Denton was charged with 4 counts of negligent homicide. The case went to trial in November 1997. The prosecution argued he'd created a dangerous situation by depleting a survival resource in a remote area. The defense argued he had no knowledge anyone would use the cabin, that it was abandoned, that the deaths were a tragic accident, but not a crime. The jury deliberated for 4 days. They returned a verdict of not guilty on all counts. The law was clear. Criminal negligence required foreseeability. Denton couldn't have foreseen that a family would arrive at an abandoned cabin in midwinter, expecting firewood that wasn't there. But the civil suit, filed by Claire's mother, was different. In April 1998, a judge awarded her nominal damages of $15,000, more symbolic than punitive. Denton paid it in installments over 3 years. The Holbrook case closed officially in June 1998. The bodies were released for burial. A service was held in Fairbanks, attended by 200 people, teachers, librarians, neighbors, strangers who'd followed the case. The local paper ran a front-page story, "Mystery solved, but questions remain." Claire's mother spoke briefly at the service. She thanked the investigators, particularly Sergeant Klein, for not giving up. She said Claire had always believed in the goodness of people, that even now she wanted to believe her daughter's last moments were peaceful, that the girls hadn't suffered. She didn't mention Carl Denton by name. The Holbrook house was sold in 1999. The new owners painted it blue and added a deck. The sourdough starter jar, washed and clean, was given to a baking museum in Anchorage, a small artifact of a life interrupted. Thomas's CB radio setup was donated to a ham radio club in Fairbanks. They refurbished it, used it for emergency drills, and affixed a small plaque, "In memory of Thomas Holbrook, who believed in staying connected." Sophie's stuffed rabbit was never found. Maya's science project was turned in by her teacher, graded posthumously, marked incomplete. The red snow boots, the ones placed carefully by the cabin door, were returned to Claire's mother as personal effects. She kept them in a box in her closet, never displayed, never discarded. When she died in 2004, her will specified they be buried with her. In 2003, the Alaska State Troopers implemented a new protocol. All remote cabins on state or federal land were to be inventoried and marked with GPS coordinates. Signs were posted at trailheads warning that unoccupied structures might lack basic survival resources. It was a small policy change, but it carried the Holbrooks' names in the internal memo. Sergeant Howard Klein retired in 2005. In his exit interview, he said the Holbrook case was the one that stayed with him, not because it was the most violent or complex, but because it was so ordinary. "A wrong turn," he said. That's all it was. A wrong turn and some missing firewood. And 4 people gone. The cabin still stands, though the Forest Service has marked it condemned. Hikers occasionally post photos online, not knowing its history. The Bronco was removed and scrapped. The notebook is in the State Archives, available for research by appointment. On February 10th every year, someone, identity unknown, leaves a small wreath at the cabin site. It's usually gone by spring, taken by weather or animals, but it reappears the next year. Investigators assume it's Claire's mother's family, though no one has claimed responsibility. The case is taught at the Alaska Law Enforcement Training Academy as an example of limitations, how good intentions, thorough investigation, and modern technology can solve a mystery, but can't undo the cascade of small decisions that led to it. The lesson isn't about blame, it's about fragility. And in the end, the Holbrooks remain frozen in that moment, in those sleeping bags, in that cabin, in the exact place they stopped. Not lost anymore, just found too late.